Boom, we are live. Thank you very much for joining me today, Derrick. So today we're going to go over myths, misconceptions of hypertrophy. So you just released a paper there in November covering this exact topic. This paper was an art review, right?
Yeah, correct. So, yeah, thanks for having me on, Shane. Correct. So, in terms of the hierarchy of evidence, it's on the lower pole, if you will. So, it did go through peer review, of course, but this is essentially a collection of what I would call like an expert opinion and then kind of synthesizing our interpretation of the literature that's been published. And obviously, we combine that with some of our personal experience and practical application to kind of provide an overview of where our opinion is on the literature of things.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask that question just more so because we had like Eric on a couple of weeks back and we were just like talking about how we interpret research and everything like that. And I guess like the question
Great
here is
researcher.
relative to something like a systematic review. What would be the process of like formulating the narrative review? Because I know like one has like obviously a very heavy focus on like inclusion exclusion criteria, and how does that kind of align with the likes of narrative reviews?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the overall question of the review. So a systematic review and meta-analysis, essentially, you can break that into two parts where you don't have to, analyze the data and just systematically review the literature. And I actually, you know, Eric Helms is a great example of that because his master's project was a systematic review. But essentially, that process is coming up with a topic that you're interested in kind of reviewing the literature on, and then you develop what's called like a Boolean search strategy, and then basically you put that into different databases. So like there's popular ones like PubMed, obviously, Sport Discus, other libraries, etc. And that gives you, based off your inclusion criteria, potential, we'll call it hits, if you will. So studies that may or may not, get flagged because they come up when you enter your search strategy in. Then you kind of go through the abstracts and you include or exclude the research based off that search. And then again, a meta analysis takes it one step further by actually analyzing that data with statistical analysis plans. So that stuff is kind of like predefined, so you can't really steer away from it. Whereas a narrative review, we have multiple topics in here. So performing like a systematic review is not really going to meet that because it's so diverse in the topic itself, right? So we talk about, mechanisms, misconceptions, etc. So we went in a few different directions, right? We talk about hormones, we talk about metabolites, the pump, how much muscle can you gain, which is just too broad for the systematic approach, right? We would never, there's no paper that's sought out to investigate that. So that's the biggest thing. And again, with that said, there's certain papers that we didn't, highlight that may, like investigate hormones specifically or metabolites, etc. We kind of discuss the overall, I would say, our overall take on the evidence based off like our experience and sense of the literature.
Yeah, I guess there is like the opportunity with the when you're doing that review to pick the studies that I guess like seem like they most align with the question versus I guess like depending on the type of criteria included in the systematic review, you could get ones popping into it which maybe have incomplete sample sizes, ask a completely different question, and then you also have to kind of solve for those. Um, but I guess like the paper itself was fairly complete and fairly thorough in looking at the the mechanisms behind how like muscles grow, and then also some of the more common things that you hear within like the training sphere that impact growth or don't impact growth. So starting off from the top, right? Mechanical tension. That's what everybody says is the number one driver of hypertrophy. I guess we could probably kind of start off with this. So like when we say like mechanical tension, what does that even mean from a training?
Yeah, yeah, good question. Good question. Um, I think about it like this, and we talked about this a lot, and I think this is important to kind of we almost need to revisit that of an aside. So I'm glad you brought that up right out of the gates because everyone does say mechanical tension is the primary driver, and that's exactly what we're saying. And people go, well, what exactly is mechanical tension, right? So And it's like uh, basic when you think about muscle hypertrophy, that happens as an adaptation at the fiber level. Okay, so our muscle fibers get bigger and then we increase in size either in parallel, which is largely the contribution, and then also in series, which I can get into as well. But essentially, at the fiber level, again, we have the smallest unit is sarcomeres, which consists of these proteins, actin and myosin. And essentially, they shorten to contract, and through tendon linkage to the bone, that's how I'm moving my limbs, and that's how it's responsible for locomotion, etc. And so that's the biggest thing there. So when we think about mechanical tension, that is the force that's generated by the fibers both during active contraction or passive stretch, right? So when we place an external load, right, like a dumbbell or a machine on the muscle, we recruit the muscle fibers to contract to overcome the external demands of the load. And so that tension is somehow sensed, and we're still trying to disentangle what, that is. But essentially, that is this process known as mechanotransduction, which is the biochemical conversion of that mechanical tension to basically initiate a cascade of signaling processes to lead to the accretion of additional contractile proteins. So the addition of what we call myofibrils, which again are those smallest contractile units, and that leads to this radial hypertrophy. That is largely the adaptation. It's well documented now when we resistance train. But interestingly enough, there's also some, longitudinal hypertrophy that can also happen. So the sarcomeres actually not only increasing in series, so not only increasing in parallel, but also increasing in series, which can also increase our muscle size. And that is interesting because it does seem that those sensors are independent mechanisms. So when we think about, passive tension, lengthening contractions, large proteins such as titans seem to be more responsible for sensing that, and thus leading to this increase in series. Whereas it's different things responsible for this, let's call it the lattice to the extracellular matrix of the muscle fiber. So things like a focal adhesion kinases and complexes there that are associated with this response to increase hypertrophy in parallel.
Okay. So would those be essentially, would we be looking at slightly different training styles for either of those, or would I be more thinking along the lines of like it's more so the lengthening is like this very bro sounds very bro the lengthening phase, it could potentially be something if we're having more tension there, failing in that position, we could be having an increase in the series, and then if on more kind of the contraction phase, that could be more similar towards it in parallel. Would that be in the right frame of mind?
Yeah, yes, I think no, it's a good question. I think we're still trying to, I guess, elucidate what's going on there. So, my good buddy and colleague Dan Plotkin is looking at that right now in Mike Roberts' lab at Auburn. So, shout out Dan. He's a super smart guy, one of the smartest guys I've ever met. But he's looking at this effect of lengthening contractions and how that may change the hypertrophy adaptation. So, in short, it does seem to be two separate adaptations, but we're trying to figure out sort of that mechanism in, let's call it, the magnitude of these adaptations. In short, like, yeah, that could be, explain why, the eccentric portion, and again, during the eccentric, or in, like, let's say a pause in the lengthened position or these lengthened partials, right? It's not like the fibers are just relaxed, right? You're still under contraction. We call that like the lengthening contraction, right? Because they're still actin and myosin are still bound together, so they're just lengthening. That allows the muscle to lengthen, right? But they don't completely release. So that's important. So the eccentric part to me certainly is important, and something not to be ignored. And obviously, we have some evidence now where the eccentric component is just as stimulative of growth if we think about from an outcomes perspective. And yeah, obviously the shortening the active contraction, getting the fibers to essentially get to the point where you can't contract anymore or close to failure, etc., is obviously going to stimulate growth.
Yeah, I think the the discussion around like is the eccentric important? It's an interesting one because like I don't know why we would have a discussion that's so like binary of like is this part of the rep important or that rep more important, because it's unlikely that even if the eccentric wasn't important that you would ever really do just concentric only training. Like imagine
Yeah.
like how many bodybuilders do you know that when they're looking to grow their quads they hop on an exercise bike and they just progressively increase the resistance on it? None, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if the eccentric was anything matter, like I don't know, maybe more eccentric dominant type of cardio. I don't know. You could maybe say like weighted running potentially, like weighted sprinting, like parachute sprinting. You're not doing that to increase the size of your hamstrings. So like, I don't
Yeah,
understand
for
why
sure.
it is a discussion, because you can't really separate them on the majority of movements. Like in my eyes, if you're looking to maximize hypertrophy, you try to make the most of both and not go to any extreme where you're saying, okay, concentric is more important, so I really need to slow it down, or if the eccentric is really
Yeah.
important, I need to slow it down too much. Like obviously there's plenty of research showing like the effects of many different tempo ranges on hypertrophy, and if your rep is lasting like no longer than 8 seconds from a start to the rep to the end of the rep, it seems like that would still be an appropriate tempo. Once the last few reps are like actually getting slow.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's why I love having these conversations with, fellow bodybuilders and coaches like yourself, because that's the important thing to remember here. Like the eccentric component is certainly going to be just as important in my eyes. Like from an applied standpoint, I agree. I can't imagine. I think the conversation could become again, the lengthening contraction, the time in the lengthened position, right? And I know that's a hot topic and the whole lengthening partial aspect of things. But I would say when you look at that aspect of it, it doesn't seem to hinder adaptation. So I think of it like, like I work with Brian Miner from 3DMJ, and I know you used to work with Brad, of course. So, great guys. And when you think about it from a practical applied standpoint, yeah, we do like lengthened partials in the range where I cannot do another concentric, but I'm still able to hang out. So, I did it this morning with, unilateral pull downs. I'm hanging out at, my last set, I go to failure and then I'll do lengthened partials, around 25% of that range. And that's just because they feel good. And I don't think there's a lot of fatigue generated from doing those, right? So mostly exercises that give credence and the utility for it. So again, a lot of back work, do it for calves in the lengthened position. I'm certainly not getting on a hack squat and doing quarter reps in the bottom position and getting buried on the pins though, So there's some judgment, so be judicious with how you incorporate them, of course. But by and large, I think just like anything, right? It's a tool in the toolbox, and um, it's worth a try. I mean, I know Berto's been a big fan of that with his back work he just shared a little bit ago, and I mean, I'm not going to argue with him.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. Look, I think if you look across many different bodybuilders, a lot of them have slightly different training styles, different training theories, and you know, if the outcome, them looking jacked as fuck is the evidence. I mean, obviously you could maybe nitpick on some things that just wouldn't make sense, and it could just be explained by genetics. But I think if you look at like successful bodybuilders on like a group average, a lot of the variables they have in place I'd say are very much aligned with like what of a lot of the evidence would be leaning towards. So I guess when we're discussing the tension perspective, right? Because I guess like this is something that I have seen claimed online time and time again, and it's kind of more so around like rep ranges, right? So like a lot of people, I think, only consider mechanical tension from the aspect of the tension needs to be super high from the get go. So we're seeing a lot of people adopting like 4 to 8 as like a kind of standard rep range. It'll have that across like every single movement, and the thought process is, well, if external load is high, internal force will also be high. But I don't think that's the case all the time, right? Considering we have plenty of studies to show that like high repetitions are still leading towards muscle. So I wonder, like if you know how to explain like from a force requirement perspective, like going on there to increase the tension to get that like adaptation we're looking for?
Yeah, good question. So I'll preface by saying that's kind of part of my PhD work right now is doing that work with females. But from an applied standpoint, yeah, mechanical tension and obviously as a result, hypertrophy can be achieved across a wide range of loading paradigms, right? So there's a lot of versatility when it comes to programming design. Now, as I got a lot of respect for you being in the powerlifting space as well. So you as a powerlifter can appreciate, you know, I love lifting heavy. There's the 4 to 8 rep range by all means, right? But at the same time, you're dealing with the knee issues, the elbow issues, et cetera, shoulder from moving the amount of weight that you do. The good thing is you can dial the external load back and train in these higher repetitions, right? And so you don't have as much tension on the muscle at the start of a set. But what happens is we have this kind of phenomenon known as motor unit recycling, right? And so what that means is when you use a lower load, so let's say we're training in the 20 to 25 rep range, right? So we're, somewhere 30, 50% or somewhere if somebody's 1 rep max, but like I like the rep ranges just to be constant. Out of the gates, we are largely going to use more of our type 1 oxidative muscle fibers. So just to step back for a moment for the audience, like we have 2 different fiber types associated with humans. So we have type 1 and type 2, and we can talk about a continuum after. But in short, type 1, type 2. Type 1 are more fatigue resistant. Those are more oxidative. So they are more meant for long enduring exercise or things like, when we're standing and walking, etc. Right? Our type 2 fibers are more explosive, generating a lot of power and force, but they fatigue very rapidly. But those fibers are kind of reserved for those periods where we need to produce high amounts of force. And so what happens is there's something called Henneman's size principle, which basically dictates your muscle fibers are recruited in order of the demands. And so when we start out with a lower load, we're largely using those lower threshold motor units and muscle fibers that don't really produce a lot of force, but they are producing enough force to overcome the load demands. And then what happens is, as we continue to get repetitions accrued, the motor units start to recycle and regenerate, but eventually they get fatigued and they can no longer meet that task. So that's when they essentially say, okay, come on in, type 2, high threshold, motor unit, muscle fibers, etc. We need your help. And so that's why it's important for the lower load condition to train with a close proximity to failure, a high degree of effort. But that's why you see equivalent hypertrophy in these adaptations, because at the end of the day, the fibers responsible for the adaptations in hypertrophy largely are those type 2 fibers. And so they're getting recruited to meet the force demanding tasks of the higher repetitions.
Yeah. So I guess it's kind of like if you're on a leg press and you're doing a set of 5 from like the how fast you move that last rep, or how slow it realistically moves if it's to failure, you're probably producing a similar amount of muscular force relative to if you did a set of 12 to failure and the sled is moving in around the same speed. External loads are different, but the internal response and what your body
exactly. So yeah, and that's where the conversation of this force velocity comes into play, because it is true where you can generate a lot of mechanical or motor unit recruitment without a whole lot of tension, right? Like you can do a maximal jump and you're going to have a lot of motor unit recruitment, not a lot of tension on your fiber. So that's where this force velocity relationship comes into play. We need to have a high amount of tension in conjunction with the motor unit recruitment so that we have this interplay of actin, myosin, etc. So that's where out of the gates, a heavier load is going to be, we'll call it superior, if the lower load is not taken to failure, because the higher load is going to recruit those higher threshold motor units earlier or right off the gate in a set of 4, for example, because the type 1s do not have the force generating capacity to meet those demands.
Yeah, the thing I always think about when I'm programming the lower rep ranges is obviously the type of movement they're doing, like how much skill is involved, and then also like the person's ability to actually train that heavy. Because like if you get somebody who's like in their first like maybe year of the gym, using that type of rep range, probably out the gate, they probably don't have as much access or like neuromuscular efficiency to like get those high threshold motor units, big muscle fibers to working out the gate. Obviously, it's something that is trained, right? But then as well, the likes of the skill demand. You know, like you give a beginner a set of four squats, and you're like, right, we're gonna go heavy today. They probably do so much better by doubling the amount of reps they're doing and doing 8 and get a better benefit because they're also just getting like more practice at that skill itself. So it is one of those things that anytime I see people talking about it, you know, it tries to paint train for hypertrophy as like this like very binary black or white, like you must do this, you must do that to actually achieve the goal, whereas it's so context dependent.
Yeah, like I can't stress that enough. Is like hypertrophy is such a forgiving adaptation. It can be achieved across a wide range of loads, machines, free weights, body weight, right, etc. Like, BFR for extremely low loads can help. Like, there's so many tools in the toolbox, and I'm not a fan of like the blanket binary. Like, you have to lift heavier, you have to lift light. It's like you said, context dependent. Certainly, if you want to maximize your strength, there's the practice effect and principle of specificity, which is a guiding pillar to program design. But yeah, like you said, the skill, like a beginner, like certainly, like maybe you want to give that moderate 8 to 12 rep range, right? It also depends on the exercise. Like for you, an advanced lifter, I wouldn't have you do a set of 20 squats because you're too strong to get to the point where you're going to shift your load demands from, let's say it's a high bar squat and we're focusing on your quads, right? By rep 20 you're shifting the load from your quads onto your posterior chain glutes, good morning squat, if you will. So turning it into that for those muscle groups. And now we're taking the load demands off the quads, which is not our objective. For powerlifting, if somebody turns a set of 4 into a good morning, depending on the context, right? It's not maybe not the ideal, we'll call it form, but the goal for powerlifting is to move from point A to point B. So within the confines of obviously, being safe. But if there's some shift in load demands, at the end of the day, I don't care, right? If they're completing the task. Whereas if we're doing a quad biased high bar squat, we're going to stop once you switch the load demands. So that, in my opinion, is much easier to take closer to failure or stay in the target musculature on something like even a pendulum squat, right? Where, you're largely quad dominant, or a leg extension where there's no, I don't want to say no, but little skill involved in a leg extension, right? So that's where the utility comes in, as that's coaching 101, picking the right, exercises and rep range for your clients and yourself and et cetera. But, that can certainly be a fun process to kind of figure out what works best for you and your roster as well.
What would you say are like the main things somebody would need to consider within, like, a training session to ensure that they're achieving this like goal of like getting higher levels of mechanical tension?
Yeah, thinking about from a hypertrophy standpoint, thinking about your target musculature, staying within that and getting close to or reasonably close to failure with a high degree of effort. So that again, compound lifts are maybe harder to, let's say, perceive, but it should be, again, if you're thinking about focusing on your specific musculature, on a, let's say a hack squat or a leg press, you should be, if it's a quad bias, movement, you should be thinking about getting close to failure, staying in on those quads, making sure they're working, getting a stimulus, and that's ultimately going to be the crux of it all, right? Um, doesn't matter if the load is heavy or light. If you take it close enough to failure, you're going to generate sufficient tension, and that's what's going to stimulate growth.
I think it kind of natural segue here, considering you mentioned it doesn't matter if it's heavy or light. A lot of people will say that when they train heavy, that they don't get much of a burn, they don't get much of a pump, and the higher repetitions, middle of the hypertrophy rep range just seems to work better because, they can feel their muscles working more. They're getting the pump. So maybe you could explain to us like how this actually relates to growing muscle, like, and how much does it really even matter?
Yeah. So I think I always like to kind of preface like I am not like anti-pump or anything like that. I'm not like I'm a bodybuilder. I love the pump. I do, but it's a byproduct of contraction. And as you noted, it can be largely influenced by repetition range, right? Like I did a hack squats yesterday for sets of 6. I don't feel a pump in my quads, right? I'm feeling it more in my face from like, bracing and stuff. But my quads are extending my knees. That's the function of the quad. So we think first principle, that's ultimately again pushing close to failure. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you're doing, same just sorry, I'm thinking of my own training from yesterday, but like you do a set of 15, 20 leg extensions, feeling a pump there, right? Depending on the context, but certainly there. I don't want to, excuse me, I don't want to say that that is what's stimulating growth. It was the fatigue that got me there. And that pump is this transient swelling from the increased blood flow, right? So if you think about muscle contraction, we actually, our veins occlude to hold blood in there, and then the arteries carry oxygenated blood into the muscle. So we basically get this, we'll call it like this area gets engorged, right? After engulfed when you train. And so like that is a good thing, but it's ultimately just like a transient thing, right? So we know that feels good, right? We bodybuilders, we chase the pump, but it's not a necessarily mechanism for hypertrophy. And so I think that's important. The other thing I think is important to acknowledge is circling back is repetition range can largely influence that. So you don't necessarily feel it on a pump, but also the musculature involved can influence that, and I can elaborate a bit more, but also repetition range, hydration, glycogen status, right? Like, I love having this conversation with somebody like yourself who's been absolutely shredded, right? How hard was it to get a pump deep in prep when you're low on glycogen, you're low on everything, right? But you're maintaining your muscle, right? Like it's not, yeah, right. You're holding on, right? Because you're training. You're giving your body stimulus and impetus to hold on to muscle tissue, right? It might not be the environment for growth because also, you're in an energy deficit, right? Like a quite large one. So that's a whole other thing. But right, you're still giving your body the signal to stimulate new proteins. I like to think about it as like my experience, obviously research with females and then working as a coach and, gym owner, et cetera. Like over the years, on average, women have smaller muscle, right? That's no, groundbreaking finding. But at the same time, they also have, we can elaborate more on the adaptations from training, but on average, females also have more type 1 oxidative fire. So I was mentioning about fatigue resistance. They also have more capillary density, so that the actual like in the blood, they have more capillary cells that are actually delivering blood to the musculature, right? So all that alone can allow the muscle to get perfused with oxygenated blood, which can also mean that they have less fatigue accumulation, less metabolites, and less, of a feeling of a pump, right? So some females that I've worked with and et cetera, they'll say like they have a hard time perceiving the pump. And I think that is the crux of it all. And I think the pump can be informative for sure, but I think it's important to acknowledge that the pump is a subjective perception during the exercise, right? So that's I think really important to say. The pump should not be mistaken for internal muscle swelling, which may or may not be associated with hypertrophy, because you can have instances of swelling without the pump and you can have the pump without swelling, right? So those are two. I don't like how they're used interchangeably, to be completely honest, but yeah, I think that's kind of where I would acknowledge that. Like if pump is great, if it keeps, and we talk about that in the paper, right? If it allows you to adhere to your program, keep training hard, and that's the most important thing is the consistency, right? Then by all means, get after it. But I wouldn't design my programming around the principles. Again, as a coach, communicate with your athlete, like, if you enjoy it, if you feel it, etc. Great, it can be informative. Obviously, following a set of biceps, if your biceps are larger, then it's probably doing, its job. But at the same time, if you don't experience a pump, I wouldn't, I wouldn't panic and and think that you're not, getting any gains there.
Yeah, I think of, day-to-day activities that people may do, or, just even as a bodybuilder, right? When you're practicing your posing, you get a pump. Like, I don't know, when you're well fed,
Yeah.
everything. And like, you don't think during that time that you're growing, do you? Like, so like, it's one of those things. It's like training can lead to the pump happening, but the pump does not necessarily mean that you are growing additional tissue, because I guess, like, well, yes, you may be contracting your biceps and producing force. There's no, like, the biceps themselves are not being placed under like resistance under load and like getting pushed towards a meaningful level of, like, I guess, the mechanical tension, as you kind of mentioned at the start of the podcast. Of course they can fatigue, and I think there is like a paper out there, isn't there? I remember it came out years ago of like people just doing unloaded bicep curls, and just like really focus on contracting the bicep as hard as they can, and like contracting the tricep, and there was some growth there, but like that's completely different then, because like there's still external load, right? Like the load, the weight of your forearm is a load, and if you curl your arms enough times, there will be inevitably some type of like resistance challenge placed upon the bicep.
Yeah, that was like the no load study. I think that
Yeah.
was with like Samuel Buckner and Jeremy Lineke's group. Yeah, there's some great researchers there too, for sure. Um, and that's it, right? You have these adaptations. At some point, that's where it's context dependent, because then we come back to this, motor unit recycling and fatigue. At some point, the
Yeah.
load does get too low and the
Yeah.
repetitions get too high. And so what I mean by that is, because you have the byproduct of contraction, so you have these metabolites pooling in. If the load is too low, you can either continue to generate the type 1 fibers to continue to recycle and not get close to fatigue, and people will stop their set from the discomfort of these metabolites, the burn, if you will, and then that's not going to be generating the tension needed at the type 2 fiber level to really get close to failure. You're actually just quitting because the effort is just too hard, right? And so there's that. But then you have the utility for things like blood flow restriction training, which we talk about a little bit, but that the restriction of blood obviously leading to the accumulation of metabolites seems to drive fatigue, and that's where this utility for the lower loads come in, and because you're getting close to failure, and that's why we see equivalent hypertrophy when we use BFR or traditional resistance training, which is a great strategy, right? Like, I love BFR. I'm not sure if you've used it,
Yeah, I've used
but
it.
when the joints are hurting, man, I like to think of BFR as it hurts so good, because yeah, I love it.
Yeah, man, I remember when like the lockdowns are happening. Like, I was training at my backyard because I had a squat rack and I had a couple of dumbbells, like, the cement like type dumbbells, like the York.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Had a set of
yeah.
those.
Phil was saying.
I think I could only get up to maybe like 15 kilos on them. I couldn't put any more, so I was doing BF4 all day. And before the barbell came, before the barbell and squat rack came, I was using that cement set, and I was doing like walking lunges up and down my garden with like a shitty barbell on my back, BF4 on, then supersetting that with like some split squats and some actual like front squats. Oh, it was what a time to be
Yeah,
alive.
yeah, for sure. But you can see right there, right? That's a perfect example of like making, you know, progress and making do with what you have, right? And so that's important. So yeah, that uh, again, like, you push things hard, and that's why you're finding external ways to get the fatigue at the musculature, because yeah, at some point, depending on the exercise, like, a curl of your forearm, at some point your forearm's just too light. You're not going to generate any fatigue. You add in that sand in a cuff or a tourniquet, and now we're cooking, right? So
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah, it does seem like already all roads are leading back to the mechanical tension as like the main thing that we're kind of looking towards, because we already discussed there, like, the pump being nice and all, and it's extremely enjoyable, makes you feel like a god when you're in the gym, but probably not
Hmm.
necessarily something that is going to, you know, if you just chase the pump, you will probably be forever just like hope like being big for that portion of time in the gym, if you're not taking your sets relatively close to failure. But then, like, I guess, like, tied on to that is like the question of like, metabolic stress, right? Because that years ago when like Brad first released that paper on like, the primary mechanisms of hypertrophy is like mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and like muscle damage was thrown in there as well. So like within your paper, you had a section on metabolites. So like when people talk about metabolites, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah. So essentially, when you contract, right, we use like our energy currency, otherwise known as ATP or adenosine triphosphate, right? So most folks probably have heard of that before, but if not, that's okay. But essentially, when you contract, you have these. Essentially, you're left with the accumulation of these metabolites, and particularly lactate, inorganic phosphate, and hydrogen ions essentially. And so those are collectively kind of coined as the metabolites for metabolic stress, right? Excuse me. And so that is maximized when you are essentially using exercises that are relying on what's called non-oxidative glycolysis, right? So you don't have oxygen present for energy production. So to regenerate ATP, we're doing it in the absence of oxygen. Yeah, sorry. And so when we have contraction, so we basically are left with a reduction in phosphocreatine levels, and that leads us to buffer against this changes in cellular energy status, essentially. And so the imbalance of the non-oxidative and oxidative glycolytic flux, if you will, leads to this entrance of pyruvate, which is done through PDH or pyruvate dehydrogenase, and that essentially gets into what's called the TCA cycle, or the tricarboxylic acid cycle, and oxidative metabolism. So all that in short is what that does is it leads to this elevation in lactate, and that lowers pH levels, right? So that makes things more acidic, right? It leads to an acidic environment. So we should note, I think I always like to think about it this way as well. We also have that happen in obviously weight training, but we also have that in things like sprinting, 1,500-meter runs, etc. The things that are short, hence all-out effort bouts of exercise, right? So the in short, I guess, it's been proposed that this metabolite accumulation during low loads may offset the lower mechanical tension, and then that it activates a response to promote growth, which is comparable to high load. That could be more of a, I would say, more of a permissive role to fatigue, but certainly not an independent driver. And so what I mean by that is it's not, metabolites aren't really playing an independent stimulus to growth, because what would happen is essentially if you were to take a set, and we see this in the literature too, right? Like if you take BFR to failure, you have growth. If you take higher load traditional resistance training, you have growth. But in an environment where you pool the metabolites in addition to the higher load, you don't see greater growth, right? So if metabolites were an independent driver, you should see greater hypertrophy, which you don't. In conjunction with that, we also see environments where we have a ton of metabolic stress, right? Like I mentioned, sprinting, the 1,500-meter running, etc., and we don't see growth, right? And so I think that's important, right? There is evidence, I would say there's little to no evidence, sorry, to make sure that's good. There's thousands of metabolites in the blood, but the ones that are largely like thought to contribute to these anabolic processes are the lactate, hydrogen ions, inorganic phosphate that I mentioned. But again, just circling back to the similar metabolite environments, so HIIT training, sprinting, like again, they don't really lead to hypertrophy, as you know. So I think that kind of puts the argument, kind of challenges that argument right there, right? And so what I was going to mention as well is like MPS, like so muscle protein synthesis, like the response, the adaptation that actually tells us to accrue more proteins, is not stimulated when BFR is applied independent of resistance training, nor is it enough to prevent atrophy during periods of bed rest. So that alone tells me that there's a stimulus there from the contraction that is needed and the mechanical tension, and it's not these metabolites per se that is reducing or promoting growth. I think that's probably the biggest thing. Again, there's some things I can like touch on with like, lactate. I think, and Dan Lawson and Cody Hahn with Brad Schoenfeld as well have a great paper called Beyond Mechanical Tension, and kind of looking at these mechanisms in which lactate could influence hypertrophy. And on the surface, it's a great paper, and it's a good conversation. But I would say that the evidence is not there in humans. We have a few different preclinical models with it, but with rodents, they gave lactate and a stupid amount of caffeine. It was like almost 40 mgs of caffeine per kg of the mice, and they found greater increases in growth of the gastroc. But like, you're not taking 36 mgs of caffeine. So that is it. Also that with the performance adaptations, it's hard to discern. And then some work with Mike Roberts' lab actually as well, where they looked at like protein lactylation in the muscle, and and this was Madeline and colleagues, and it just wasn't there. Like it didn't in short, like, I guess, didn't really alter any of the protein lactylation, nor did it affect any of the genes associated with that. So that's kind of where I'm at, full stop, right? Like at this point, like, no human research done, or at least to show compelling evidence for that. And I do think the one thing I always think is important to note as well, like, I've thought about this for a long time, and I'm not sure it's even possible to like show causality in this scenario, because muscle contractions are associated with metabolite accumulation, right? It's very hard to show that without that, right? So, but I think, again, not all contractions result in hypertrophy, right? So any of the studies that were to support an anabolic role of the metabolites were not designed specifically to isolate this role independently of contraction. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, essentially, even if that were the case, the studies like hypothesizing a role for metabolic stress really can just be explained to mechanical loading as a result of fatigue, right? Like, as far as I'm concerned. So all that to say, yeah, in short, mechanical loading, fatigue, we have metabolites as a byproduct. So really, to hypothesize metabolic stress, I don't think it's needed.
Yeah, I guess to go back to something you mentioned earlier on, like when you perform those sets where you have like that build up and like acidosis and everything like that going on within the muscle, you're typically using something, north of 8 reps, like all the way up towards like, the very high repetition ranges. Again, most people are sitting around that mid range, maybe 8, training mostly in like the 6 to 15 rep range, you could say. And
Mm-hmm.
you did mention when we're looking at those type of repetition ranges, you're having a lot more of the type 1 contribution at the start of the set. Then as demands increase, you get more type 2. And then with the size principle like taking place then as well, bigger motor unit recruitment. Now, okay, we're getting more higher forces being generated within the muscle. So it's like, if it was a case where you just stopped where you start to feel like the acidosis kick in, it could be a case you're still far away from failure, especially if like you go very, very high at repetition range, right? Maybe you go 15 to 20. Then, as you pointed out earlier, it could just be discomfort and pain tolerance or cardiovascular challenge that actually inhibits you from pushing beyond that. And that all just comes back to like the programming, right? It just comes down to like what rep range suits this exercise the best and suits this person's mentality the best and what's most efficient, because I think like even if metabolic stress was something that was like very, very meaningfully contributing to hypertrophy, I don't know how well people would be able to adhere to that as a main form of training relative to just increasing like loads over time, increasing like reps close to the failure over time. It's because they wouldn't have to suffer as much. Like it's set of 6 to 8 is still difficult and it's still challenging, but it's like the sets I dread the most are not the ones where I do 6 to 10 reps. They're the ones where I see 15 to 20, or I'm doing like a Maya rep set or something like that, I'm like, fuck my life. Like, this is going to be miserable, you know?
Yeah, no, for sure. And so, like, you made a really good point. I think that's important too with the cardiovascular demands, right? So, I think that's important too, right? If you can't get to failure because you're limited by your lung capacity and the repetition range, that certainly can be a limiting factor, right? And like you mentioned, so, all tools in the toolbox, if you will. And I think those are all important considerations when choosing those repetition ranges, right? And so, you know, um, yeah, 8 to 12 is still, we'll call it a ideal rep range just from a practicality standpoint for bodybuilding. But yeah, like I love the 4 to 6, and sometimes I love 15 to 20. 20 to 25, depending on the context. But you're right, right? Like so. That's where volume also comes into play too, because I can do one hard set at 20 to 25, but to match that on the second set, depending on the exercise, that gets tough because now you are dealing with those metabolites and that discomfort. So, ultimately, there's that dose response relationship with volume and growth. So it's about picking your spots, right?
Yeah, like the very high rep like exercises, or even like doing it for like, the high rep ranges, even doing it for like maybe a session or two is fun. But like, yeah, once you get up into the like, okay, now I have to push towards like new limits or new levels of performance. That's when it like just starts to really suck, and like it's very easy to like talk yourself out of going for that extra rep, and then you look back at the video and you're like, oh, I had two more there, So
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
sometimes it's just more practical to lean towards like the lower end of the rep spectrum, I guess. Um, one part that one
Hmm.
thing you covered in the a lot of stuff I talk about like the last like 30 minutes or so, it's been very much associated with high repetitions and low rests, and and pumps and stuff like that. And I guess like that's kind of like one of the theories with hormones, isn't it? It's like when we have maybe short rest intervals or we do high repetition ranges, we can have like higher levels of circulating, whether it's growth hormone, or post session will have higher levels of testosterone circulating. I from reading your paper, I know it doesn't matter, and I guess like could you explain like what the research would kind of show on that front?
Yeah, and so I think this is a really good conversation because again, I love chatting with other bodybuilders, but you may have done this in the past. So I'll start by saying what I've done in the past. So I squatted every day for over 300 days straight, obviously to get my squat stronger, but I was also told that my upper body would grow as a
Yeah,
result of increases
testosterone.
in these putative rises in testosterone and growth hormone and insulin growth factor 1, or IGF-1, if you will. My legs got stronger, my squat got stronger. I don't think my bench press followed suit because I wasn't giving it as much attention, right? Certainly not influenced by hormones. So I want to make the distinction with the endogenous hormones and the exogenous. So first thing, for fellow bodybuilders that take exogenous steroids, they work. They, separate mechanisms, things like that. That's not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about is these acute systemic rises, right? So you train a certain way or you do things like short rests to get these fluctuations in these hormones, right? So we talked about testosterone, growth hormone, IGF-1. Now, it was hypothesized that they had a causative role with hypertrophy, right? But the evidence, from my lab and others that set out to investigate that kind of refutes that. So the first one I always like to kind of start with kind of, looking back at prior research to kind of like tell the story, right? So Sarah Wilkinson, she employed a unilateral design. So they took 10 young males and had them train one leg 3 times a week. And they looked at, you know, obviously the leg training led to increases in, test, GH, IGF-1, cortisol, and we can talk about that as well. But they found significant hypertrophy in the leg that trained only. So the other leg didn't grow, right? And that obviously was also followed suit with strength. And the untrained leg didn't increase significantly despite the cross education effect. What that is just telling us right there, hypertrophy can occur without any change in the systemic elevated leg, right? So when you employ that unilateral design and training on separate days, that really allows things to kind of find that. The second part is a guy named Dan West is great. He's done some really great work in math. He looked at it from a MPS response, right? So they had guys do unilateral bicep workout, and essentially they would do this following what they called a high hormone condition, but it's basically following a heavy leg session. And so then one arm would train following the legs while the hormones were elevated, and then the other arm would train on the days that the hormones were returned back to baseline. And essentially, no difference despite 4 or 5-fold elevations in these hormones. But when you looked at muscle protein synthesis and some of the key signaling proteins associated with that, so one that's really common is also known as P7, there was no differences. And so that essentially the author said, you know what? Acute hormonal elevations are not enhanced during the fed state, and following MPS is not increased to a greater magnitude. They then followed that up because it was an acute design. They did it for 15 weeks, same thing, chronically elevated hormones following the training intervention. And again, no differences in growth, right? So that then, the consideration was, well, oh, this is, untrained males, like, everything's going to lead to growth, et cetera. So then one of the things that got extended was doing it in trained males. So some researchers, Rob Morton and Sarah Oikawa, did this with trained young males. Again, 12 weeks of training, higher versus lower load, no differences in the load or the hormone profile to influence muscle growth. Circling back to Dan West, because he did some really good work here as well. He took a sample, 56 people, and looked at gains in lean body mass, and there was no association in gains in lean body mass with the transient hormonal fluctuations. And that was one thing that Stu and I had chatted about. He had one over the 16 weeks, a participant gained 7.6 kilos of lean body mass, which is in 16 weeks is a lot. They had somebody else gain like hardly any lean body mass. The hormonal milieu was relatively the same in those participants. So I think that is really cool and kind of suggests obviously there's other factors at play leading to the response and gains. I think my biggest argument would be the sex-based difference literature, if you will, or not. And that would be that, so Dan West also looked at if there was a sex-based differences in muscle protein synthesis over like a 24-hour period following resistance training. Despite the lower testosterone, of course, no differences in muscle protein synthesis rates. And then when you actually look at the pooled meta-analytical data from Brandon Roberts wrote a great one with Greg Knuckles and James Krieger in like 2020. And then that got updated with Martin Ruffalo, who's a great researcher from Australia, and he published his update. And from an absolute standpoint, of course, males have greater muscle strength on average. But when you begin a resistance exercise training program, they hypertrophy and gain strength at a relatively similar rate. And have some unpublished data right now that I can corroborate those findings in females a little bit further. So yeah, it seems like that's the biggest thing right there, right? So if males and females, when they start lifting, have the opportunity to hypertrophy, that is indicative that the protein response in your muscle tissue when you contract has a much more important role in growth than any hormones, in my opinion. So again, when it comes back to the localized, mechanical tension, mechanical transduction responses, what's driving growth. Yeah, to sum that up, it's a fallacy, to think the hormones aren't elevated long enough to do what was hypothesized they would do, which is essentially translocating across the cell membrane and then binding to a nuclear receptor, and then essentially would translocate into the nucleus of the cell and affect gene transcription, and then obviously affect the response and stimulate hypertrophy. And they don't do that. They return to baseline the next day. So they're just, in terms of the endogenous hormonal response, they don't seem to influence adaptations.
Yeah, I guess as well, like when I think hormones, they're definitely like an area that's very heavily focused on, because I feel like obviously it can be very easy to market like hormone improving training programs, especially as people get older and stuff like that. And especially since like so many guys are being like flagged with ads on Instagram or accounts be like, are you tired sometimes? Like, do you feel like you're feeling a little bit old right now? Maybe you have low testosterone. Like, have you got low ambitions in life? Just
Yeah.
these type of things get marketed towards men the whole time, and I guess like with that, it's very easy for people to fall in the rabbit hole and be like, okay, like this is something I really need to heavily focus on. My big issue as well is like they're the same people who won't go and get blood tests to check if like their hormones are slightly out of whack, and then even at that case, like to be honest, a lot of my clients, if they have any of these issues, I say, well, before you get a blood test, let's improve your fucking lifestyle habits first, because like if you have shitty lifestyle habits, you're likely gonna you could be on the lower end of the spectrum, and it's not necessarily the poor hormone profile that's highlighted on a blood test to impact your results. It's the fact that your lifestyle habits don't support the muscle gain process, right? Like you have a low protein diet, inconsistent calorie intake, you're not sleeping well, stress is through the roof, you're not consistent with training. Those things are having a much bigger impact on your muscle gain ability than your testosterone be lower, right? So it's like the low testosterone in that case could be more a symptom, but it's not like the root of the issues as such. And one thing you also mentioned was cortisol, right? And like the acute elevations that happen within like whether that's like short rest or high repetitions or something that's like highly stressful. Like there's also like that elevation in cortisol too. So like if you can't really kind of look at you can't just like discount one and look at the other, right? You can't just look at like the quote unquote anabolic hormone and then just completely say, cortisol is probably not doing anything, right? So like if you're to say that,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm so glad you brought that up because I wanted to circle back to that. So the only hormone that was associated significantly with the work that our lab has published was cortisol. And I think that's important to, talk about because it's a stress hormone, right? And so exercise is a stressor. And that's important. Like I always mention, like one of my professors in undergrad would say, like, exercise increases your risk of dying. And people were like, what? He's like, well, while exercising, you are at a greater risk of dying, right? Blood pressure is going through the roof, heart rate, etc. You then meet exercise with adaptation, right? And so that's such a, it's a funny way of like just, highlighting that, but it's true. Cortisol goes up when we train because it's a stress response. And stress is kind of the same, but that's a good stress because you're giving your body an impetus to adapt. And so, these people that are trying to avoid cortisol and stuff like that is just, like I said, such a fallacy. And um, the other note you mentioned, so the hormone levels of like clients, et cetera, you're spot on, Shane. Like this chronic reduction in your natural testosterone probably is going to influence your response. But that's because, like you mentioned, you have the normal range is quite large, somewhere let's say 300 and 1,000 nanograms deciliter test, right? So it's quite broad. James Krieger's done a really good analysis on weightology where it's like it might be predictive of like your baseline lean body mass, but it's not associated with your gains from resistance training, like following a program, right? So that's good. But when you think about the chronic reduction, well, if you start supplementing with an exogenous, we'll call it pharmacology to bring your testosterone higher, then you're always those hormones are chronically elevated. So it's essentially like going through, puberty all the time. Maybe not to that extent if it's just like a supplement or, let's call it TRT or whatever, but that's still, still exogenous use. So yeah, they're probably going to help you, but by and large, like you mentioned, unless it's an exogenous, an anthe, like taking your health and like your habits, like getting your sleep dialed in check, your nutrition in check, your exercise activity, and of course body fat levels too. Like if you have too high of a body fat, then you have aromatase inhibiting testosterone and things like that. That can, and converting to estrogen lowering tests, that could maybe influence your adaptations. But again, that is a separate thing to these acute rises. Like I said, we talked about, the the classical, oh, take 60 seconds rest because you're going to elevate your chest and it's going to lead to greater gains, which we know now from, work from Schoenfeld's group, other groups. My colleague, UBC, James McKendry, did his master's in that, so shout out James. He's a brilliant guy. And again, we found that, he found, you actually blunt hypertrophy because you're not recovered enough. And we talked about the metabolites and not being able to recruit the fire, et cetera. So we now know, hey, take as much time as you need to, ready to go again. And don't worry about your spike in tests because it's not going to influence it.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant, because it is still to this day one thing you'll hear all the time circulated online. Like, as you were saying, with your experience where you're squatting every day because you're thinking it's going to increase your upper body growth, you hear that all the time. Do compound lifts because you're going to spike all these different hormones. Like, it doesn't matter. It does not matter.
Yeah, and I mean, you've probably been on stage with guys that have big legs and small arms, and
Yeah.
or vice versa, big arms and small legs, right? Like Layden Norton always says, you got to be willing to suffer for your legs to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the final things I want to talk to you about was the last segment of the paper. You were talking about like the somebody's growth potential over their training career, and I think this is the unanswered question. Like, what is like what's the natty limit? So
Yeah.
based off what you were kind of researching for the paper, like, where can we expect our gains to essentially like start to plateau and kind of waver?
Yeah, good question. So the fun part about that paper was, and this was a large part of chatting with Jeff through, like, he wrote about this in his book. And so we kind of had some back and forth based off some other data and some bodybuilders, actually WMBF data, as well. First thing, nobody really knows, right? So we're just making proxies based off literature, and then we, kind of separated into what we would consider a higher, a normal, or lower responder. But it's very rare. I'm not going to say not possible to exceed a fat-free mass index of above 25 without the use of exogenous steroids. Now, that's not to say everyone above a 25 is, on steroids, because we see this, like Eric Trexler wrote about this in mass as well, and he did some work with collegiate football athletes. And fat-free mass can be largely influenced by other things depending on the modality, but in short, DEXA data is not entirely muscle, right? So it's also organs, body water, but it's largely muscle in terms of and tracking change. So I think that's the important thing to note. First off, is like we're just giving our best like proxy from the data, and then obviously just personal anecdote with working with athletes. I will say this, we are limited in our study designs, as with resistance training research. We're lucky to get 12, 16-week studies, right? We're shortened due to semester, et cetera. Like, I'm doing one right now that's 10 weeks long with 52 women. I've been doing it since June, and it's and this is actually what I would consider really quick turnaround, because to get that many people training, it's hard. I live here. But anyways, in short, we think that the untrained, recreationally active males should expect, on average, somewhere around 1.5 kilos or 3 pounds ish, for the freedom unit listeners, of muscle or fat free mass, right? To distinguish fat free mass in a training intervention. It's really hard to, when we have studies divided for training status, it might be on the lower end for those that are trained, may gain a little bit less, obviously, because rate of adaptation start to diminish. And then for women, we don't really know, again, if we kind of make the assumption based off the relative increases being the same. Let's say we made a proxy that 70% is a reasonable estimate, which actually checks it with some of our data right now, so I'm very excited about that. So about 70% of that is you'd see for females. So all that to say, we tracked and then plotted like what we call the delta, or the change in fat-free mass over somebody's like time course of 5 years. And we'll say like a low responder, I really don't like the word non-responder or hard gainer. I think everyone has the ability to adapt to resistance training. It's about just, modifying the program and lifestyle interventions to cater to that individual. But let's say a low responder may be anywhere from like 5 kgs, an average, and this is in males, right? So about 70% of that for females. So maybe 3 kgs for female, about 10 kgs, 8 to 10-ish for males would be like your average response, right? 5-ish for females, right? 5 to 6. And then, the upper extremes, right? We're talking over 20 kgs of fat-free mass in 5 years. You're a high-level competitive bodybuilder. I would, parsing out the DEXA data, just looking at you, right? I would be comfortable saying you probably got, at least, 15, 20 kgs of fat-free mass that you wouldn't have otherwise if you had never touched the weight, right? And then, like I said, females upper ends probably somewhere around 15 kgs, somewhere around that. Again, not all of that is entirely muscle because but largely is going to be. Yeah. What do you think?
I think if there is not a limit, like, oh, well, number one, like, you'll never know if you get there. But then there's also the case of, like, if you knew your limit, would it change anything that you do? Like, I personally, I don't think it would change anything, because I
Love it.
maybe earlier on, I would have been thinking, like, oh, how much more muscle can I gain, and, like, like, the outcome was the thing that really kind of drove me to train. Whereas, like, now it's just like part of my life. I couldn't see myself doing anything else with, whatever
Yeah.
the 10 hours of my week that I spend
Love
in
it.
the gym. So, like, I I don't like to think about it, because, like, I think one thing that definitely limits people from getting better is the thought that they can't get much better. Like, you still need to have
100%.
something to chase. You need to have, like, the carrot dangling on the stick in front of you. And if you didn't believe that, like, there was something more to get, like, that's surely going to impact your approach. Like, we were talking earlier on about, like, pushing yourself in those hard sets. When you don't know if there's an outcome at the end of that, other than just a feeling of victory of, like, completing the set, there does kind of feel like there's less kind of a meaning to keep going. So I think it's an exercise. It's an exercise of futility, really. Obviously
Yeah.
for some people, I think, and the way I'd frame it to a client if they're asking me about this is, I look at areas within their life, within their habits, within their training, that they still haven't kind of turned the dial all the way up to 100. Because I think, even with what you looked at within the paper, right, and you're, like, looking at maybe some, like, early trainees, a lot of them
Hmm.
won't have everything turned up to 100 in every aspect of, like, their habits. But when you look at, like, somebody who's, like, I personally want to be an elite natural bodybuilder, right? So I have all my dials turned up to 100 the best I can. And then you look at somebody who's also, like, like a world champion natural bodybuilder, right? They're doing everything they can to eke out the 1%. The person at the start of their journey, they might just be going to the gym consistently, and that's enough for them. But, like, as they go through the training process, the dial gets tweaked and tweaked and tweaked, and their potential for growth just continues. And obviously, that's something that will never be able to be truly studied, and it'll just have to be something that will be, like, observed, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, dude, I 100% agree with that. So I completely agree. No, I think it's a fallacy to, like, think you have this genetic ceiling in the context of, like, most people aren't going to get there, and for a plethora of reasons, right? So, like, right now I have 2 kids. Like, I have a 3-year-old daughter Ella and a 1-year-old son. Right. I'm trying to finish my PhD. My wife and I run a gym. I coach powerlifters. Like, so I have my hat in many areas. What I'm getting at is I don't have a lot of sleep. So right there, I'm not maximizing my adaptations, right? So I can't even entertain this genetic ceiling, right? That's the first thing, right? Like you said, until you get, managed lifestyle, stress, you pulling on all the levers, like, I think of guys like, Steve Hall, that is just dialed in. Like, he's a perfect example of, like, man, look at this guy still making progress. He is over a decade. Look at Jeff Alberts, right? He's 52, still bringing better package to the stage. He got, third at Worlds in 23. Like, those, like, I love that guy, man. Like, so it's not a, it's important that I think it's acknowledging that this conversation was not meant to deter or discourage anyone from pursuing their, genetic ceiling. It's more, yeah, you're probably not going to get there, but there's a host of reasons why. But it's also meant to encourage more people to get weight training because the adaptations are so robust and early, right? Like a majority of your gains that you're going to make are going to happen in years 1 to 5, especially year 1 to 2, right? So I always think it's important, like, only 1 in 5 people worldwide, right, like resistance train, and that number is self-report, so it's probably closer to 1 in 10. So to me, that's the nut we're trying to crack, is we want to get more people lifting because the overwhelming majority of the population just don't, right? And so if we can tell them, you're going to, whether you're a low responder or high responder, you can gain a ton of muscle in this short time.
Mm.
And, from the bodybuilder's perspective lens, like, yeah, you're right, man. Like, hey, do pull all the levers, get after it. And, like, don't let anybody tell you that, you're at your limit, because there's something you can do to change that. And then I think I just wanted to kind of end on, like, we talked about it in the paper, like, a few things. So our studies are limited in, like, the duration. So I always think we need to start viewing, especially at somebody like your level. Like, Shane, are you in your 3rd year off season now?
Yes, well, I competed in 2022, so yeah, I guess I am.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah, yeah,
coming
3 years
into,
of
like,
off-season, yeah,
so 2027.
2023, 2024,
Yeah.
25, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you know what I mean? Like, we need to start viewing the adaptations in the lens of months and years,
Yeah.
and not days and weeks, right? Because we'll know, and we can see this already from your physique changes, right? Where you are now to where you were at the relatively same body weight, right? But
Mm.
you'll really know when you get on stage.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big thing. But then when we circle back to Gen Pop, it's also like, okay, well, like, hypertrophy is not a limitless adaptation, right? We can talk about satellite cells and mononuclear domain theory, et cetera, at the, science level. But from the applied aspect, muscle is so important, like, beyond just hypertrophy, right? Like, we talk about reductions in cancers, all cause mortality, right? Preservations of independence, reduction in fall mobility risk, or fall risk. So it, increases our metabolic, our cognitive health, like, just everything. We talk about aging well and how important longevity is, and muscle is critical to that, right? So keep lifting, even if you're not, like, trying to optimize your gains. There's just so many other benefits with resistance training.
Mm. Yeah, it's like your body's giving you a sign that this is good for you by giving you the like rewards so early on, and it's kind of hoping along the way that you'll just be like, I just kind of enjoy this now, irrespective of the outcomes that I get from it, because like that's kind of like,
Yeah, man.
if you get past like year 2 and year 3 and you're consistent, like it's probably something that you've just adopted as an enjoyable pastime now, versus like, I'm doing this for the reward, because like that's the position I feel like I'm in, right? Like, I'm past the rewards. Of course, it's nice to see myself looking better, like, but that seeing myself looks better, as you mentioned, that's like, it takes a year before, like, oh, I actually kind of look okay.
Yeah, you got to definitely fall in love with the process and embrace the journey for sure. Because, I mean, yeah, the same boat as you, man. Like, I couldn't see myself. Like, I've devoted my entire life, like my entire life, to picking things up and putting them back down, as my brother-in-law Willie will say, which is true, right? Like, I'm here doing a PhD in muscle physiology. My hobby is weight training. I get up super early in the morning before my kids wake up so I can go to the gym. I write about gym stuff, right? I coach powerlifters for, like, I love it, right?
Yeah.
I own a gym. Like, my whole life is dedicated to stuff. I couldn't see myself doing anything else. So I guess that's the biggest message for this paper is, like, get into the gym, train hard with a high effort, consistency above all else, right? And it can be tailored to you in a wide variety of loads and machines and equipment. And again, the response is going to have a large amount of variability. Pick your parents wisely, if you will, but the overwhelming majority of the population can gain an appreciable amount of muscle mass by and strength, of course, just by getting into the gym and being consistent.
All a man needs is heavy circles, and he will be happy. One way to put it.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's
Derek,
right. That's
thank you
right,
so
man.
much for your time this evening. Is there anywhere that people can find out more about what you're up to from research perspective, where they can find you on the interwebs?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks a lot for having me, Shane. I really enjoyed our talk today, and it's always, like I said, always fun chatting with another bodybuilder and coach who's in the trenches. So thanks for that. I am a coach, powerlifting, nutrition, physique, etc. Coach for Calgary Barbell. Shout out to the team there. I work with Bryce, Danny, Taylor, and Dylan. They're a great group, a team, people to work with, and I love working with those guys. If you wanted to reach out and just chat, share some deep thoughts about skeletal muscle, you can email me, Derrick, Derrick, at calgarybarbell.com. And I might hang out on Instagram probably more than I should, Derrick_CBB. You can see things I share a lot, my research, my training, my kids, uh, and my family and stuff too. So I'm not much of a quote unquote influencer, but like I just am a human on there. So happy to chat.
Yeah, man, you contribute far more than any influencer does. So, I'd stick to what you're doing. Um, yeah,
I
look, thank you
appreciate it,
very
bro.
much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on. So what I'll do is I'll leave everything in the description there, all those links. If you did enjoy the podcast at home, go over, give Derek a follow. I'll leave the paper in descriptions off if you do want to have a read. And yeah, if you did enjoy the podcast, give it a rate and review, the podcast platform you're listening on. And we will catch you in the next one.